Hi, I'm Jon Atack, and this is a sort of introduction. Who is Jon Atack? Just in case there's anybody out there who doesn't know. So let's, Spike's going to ask me some questions. We'll see what we do with that as we go along. So go ahead, launch.
Okay. As a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
As a child, what did I want to be when I grew up? The actor Martin Shaw said a grown-up.
Yes, what did you say?
I've never had the aspiration to grow up. So it's hard to say. When I was 10, I was another lad, Alan Wright, and I were pulled out of class and had a week painting a copy of what is called the Bio Tapestry. It's actually an embroidery. And around a classroom, and that was great. And so I wanted to be a painter. Then when I was 13, I started scribbling in notebooks and I wanted to be a writer. When I was 15, I started playing the drums and for a few years earned a living doing that. And that's led to, I also wanted to answer deep philosophical questions. As yet, still working on that one. My aspirations were largely creative as a child.
Okay, fair enough. So this is one we've gone over before, but it's useful to do. Give us a brief history of how you got into Scientology, how you got out, and why you spoke out.
We have 3 topics here. We might have to take them individually because it might take a while. I got involved in Scientology when I was 19. I'd been out in Toulouse. I'd been lured out there by a guitar player who said there was work. There wasn't. I was stranded for 6 weeks. And the last week I had almost nothing to eat and was not in good condition. I got back to England and found that my girlfriend, with whom I'd been living for 15 months, had disappeared into thin air. And it took me 4 days to find her. And it gradually became clear that she'd actually run off with one of our friends and was going away with him. And I got very upset. I think more at the sense of being abandoned and deserted than it actually being a worthy relationship. And that propelled me into a series of investigations to try and regain my emotional equilibrium. I read, quite by chance, a friend of mine had taken the book Science of Survival, which I would later find was actually written by Richard DeMille, but claims to be written by L. Ron Hubbard and was certainly based upon Hubbard's ideas. DeMille never claimed otherwise. But it's well written, better so than any of the other Scientology books. And it was alluring. I didn't need to believe anything. It claimed to be a rational form of therapy. And so I went into Scientology. The people were delightful. I joined at the Birmingham mission of Scientology in the centre of England. And it was being run by people who just graduated from university. So they were a couple of years older than I was. They were lovely people. They were obviously thoroughly genuine. They weren't trying to con or scam me in any way. They believed what they were telling me. And my life became wrapped up in Scientology. By incredible good fortune, I never worked on the staff of Scientology. So the 9 years that I spent, I wasn't humiliated or abused, which is very rare. Most Scientologists will end up in trouble. The reason I didn't was because I was treated as a celebrity, because I was an artist, writer, musician. And although I wasn't making money, their policies said I was a celebrity, and so I had to be treated with kid gloves, and I was. So in 9 years, I managed to do 25 of the then available 27 levels of Scientology. To insiders, that is to say that I was operating Satan level 5, having passed through the lowly state of clear a year or two before. I was supposed to have supernatural abilities. Nobody did. I've dealt with hundreds of people who've taken those levels. Nobody has been able to demonstrate the slightest supernatural ability to me. Indeed, only one person over the years I can think of has even claimed to have had a supernatural ability. And that was, he described a hallucination, in fact, as if it were a supernatural ability. So I also did a lot of the training in Scientology. I did the Data Series Evaluators course, which is meant to be the greatest training in logic ever available to humanity. It isn't, it's nonsense. And I did various counselor training courses along the way. I left Scientology because it seemed as if it had been taken over by a sort of harsh mob of people, and that Hubbard was gone. And so many of us left believing that we were saving Scientology from some kind of hostile takeover. I was at the foundation of the UK independent movement in 1983. I published a newsletter called Reconnection, because disconnection is an essential practice that we disagreed with. I'd refused to disconnect from friends. That Reconnection ran to 33 editions over the years. I had something to do with every issue of it, one way or another. In reality, I edited most of them. But my own belief in Scientology foundered when I discovered that Ron Hubbard was a liar. And this is demonstrable in his own writings and talks. He makes claims about his own biography in one place, which he will contradict in another. So one or other of these statements has to be true. Ron Hubbard said that honesty is sanity, and I took that to heart. And it seemed to me that if he therefore was dishonest, that he could not be trusted and should not be believed. And unlike many people, rather than looking at bits of Scientology and saying, well, I don't like that bit, I looked at the whole thing and said, I'm going to reject it all, and I'll re-examine it. And if any of it is useful to me, I'll take it back. It's now, well, it'll be 39 years this year since I left Scientology, and there is nothing of any significance in Scientology that I've not found an original and better source for, because Hubbard was a dreadful plagiarist. I wrote a paper called Possible Origins for Dianetics and Scientology almost 30 years ago, which shows many places that he referred to where he'd taken material from, including his notion of the birth engram, or the trauma of birth, and the idea of past lives, which he took directly from Aleister Crowley, in fact, who also didn't talk about reincarnation, but past lives. With my disillusionment in Hubbard and my determination to review the material, there was also a desire to protect the friends I'd made in creating the independent movement. And we were all under very serious harassment and attack. I think our video is called The Perils of Investigating Scientology, which explains the harassment I received. So we'll put that up along with this, or a link to it. And I wanted to protect my friends, so I became involved in defending them in litigation. Over the years, I've worked on about 150 court cases, and I don't think we lost a single case, except for the cases that I was myself directly involved with. And things got very complicated there. But because I wanted to understand the topic, I started a very deep dive into Hubbard's life. I gathered together material, or some my own interviews, or published accounts or court testimony of about 150 people who'd had something to do with Hubbard or Scientology. And I wrote a book which was originally called The Scientology War. Collins publishers were very interested in it because, as the editor there said, it showed somebody whose mind was not really out of the subject yet. it, when redrafted, became Scientology Hubbard Through the Looking Glass. But the publisher who approached me didn't like that title. It's still called that in the bibliography of Russell Miller's wonderful Barefaced Messiah, the only really good biography of Hubbard thus far. Although Scientology has been claiming for 45 years that it will publish a biography of Hubbard.
Eventually.
Yeah, as soon as they've burned the archive material so that there's no original material to work from. I was approached in, so I left in October 1983, and I wrote a book and couldn't get it published. I had a letter from the publisher of The Mindbenders, which had sold more than 100,000 copies, which was the autobiography of Cyril Vosper, who would later become my friend. But his publisher wrote to me and said, you know, there's no point publishing a book about Scientology for a publisher because it will cost more than you can possibly make in profit. And he signed himself off, and I had this image of this man in his Savile Row pinstripe suit, man in his 70s, who signed himself off, "Death to the Evil Cult." So they certainly riled some people up along the way. And I was starting to see that, you know, there were terrible contradictions in Hubbard's accounts of himself. He was not a wounded war hero. He never saw combat. The wound that he claimed himself in an interview with Look magazine, published at the end of 1950, variously the date is given as November or December for that issue. He said that he had fallen down a ship's ladder, and that was his war wound. Later on, in the 1960s, he invented this idea that he'd been crippled and blinded. Seeing these things, I started to, you know, I wrote about that, the conflict there. I was approached by Russell Miller, who was a world-famous biographer. He'd written about Getty and Hugh Hefner. At the time, I believe he was the highest paid journalist in the UK. He was working for the Sunday Times. And the Sunday Times wanted to do a series on Hubbard, and the idea was to find where Hubbard was, track him down, which Russell was very capable of doing. And Russell was thinking about a book as a spin-off project. And he came to me and he offered me, he in fact gave me a check for £2,000. And as I'd been working for 2 years without anybody giving me anything. Well, that's not true, actually. One guy had given me £5. And, but it was through the generosity of my business partner, Robert Mitchell Beattie, that I'd been able to keep working for 2 years, because Mitch was deeply concerned that Scientology should be exposed. He was a former member as well. And so he proposed to me that he would cover all of my living expenses and give me £5 a week. And if I would carry on doing this work. So I did. Then Russell came along and gave me what proved to be a fairly small amount of money for a large amount of work. He had the manuscript to what would later become Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. And I actually now have a copy of the manuscript that I typed, you know, printed out and sent him with his notes on it. So I know which bits he took and which not. And that's fine. You know, he wrote a very good book, and he got into print before I did. But yeah, I'd let him have the manuscript, so I didn't think anybody was ever going to publish it. I'd approached 50 publishers. And so I was Russell's researcher alongside his wife, Renata. And Russell himself was a brilliant researcher. Probably about half of what's in Barefaced Messiah came from me. Certainly all the documents that he was sued for in 1987, which were documents which Scientology, most of which Scientology claimed had been under a court seal and had been stolen, which is not true. The court seal was lifted in the Los Angeles case involving Gerald Armstrong for 3 days. And I was in Los Angeles at that time, and the lawyer made sure that I got a copy of those documents. So they were legitimately obtained. They included Ron Hubbard's teenage journals of his 2 trips to China with his parents. He would later claim that he'd studied with gurus in China, Mongolia, Tibet, and India. None of these is actually true. the journals themselves, which are a record of 2 holidays, very great adventures for a teenager, but still holidays. The only mention is where he talks about the monks in the lamasery having voices that sounded like bullfrogs. There is nothing else in there. These journals, Scientology had actually put into the court case, and they didn't think anybody would ever see them, and they've not really been open or hospitable to people who want to write about Hubbard or the history of Scientology. Quite to the contrary. Indeed, the biographer they hired, Omar Garrison, who'd written 2 books that were positive to Scientology, Playing Dirty and The Hidden Story of Scientology, and both of which were commissioned for and paid for by Scientology. He was a freelance writer, but he was commissioned to write a biography, and then he was paid a large amount of money, somewhere in the region, I think, of $300,000, not to write the biography, because the documents that Gerald Armstrong had provided for him, all in good faith, because Jerry had been working for Hubbard and believed in Hubbard, but he discovered that the documents did not support the bombastic claims made by Hubbard for himself. He'd not studied with gurus. He wasn't a wounded war hero. And he hadn't studied nuclear physics at university. Indeed, Hubbard himself, in a lecture called Introduction to Dianetics in September 1950, which has been published by Scientology, admits that he studied atomic and molecular physics, not nuclear physics, and that he got an F or fail grade in the subject. So his claims to having wedded Eastern mysticism to Western science to cure his war wounds are all lies. So Miller was, there was an attempt to stop publication of his book in the UK in England. Our jurisdiction is separate, in England and Wales in 1987. And I was appointed an expert witness because all of the documents in question had come via me to Russell Miller. So probably the most important document was a letter written in August 1938 by Ron Hubbard, a typed letter to his first wife, whom he called Skipper, Dear Skipper. And this letter should be read by anybody who wants to understand Scientology. And I would say that any of the academics, like James Lewis and Gordon Melton, who've published on this subject, should be actually looking to this material. I'm going to make a comment here. I was in touch with Gordon Melton a couple of years ago, and he told me that he had intended, when he retired, to write a book about Scientology, another book about Scientology. I harshly criticized his little booklet, 60-page book about Scientology. It really is appallingly poorly researched. He simply rewrote the public relations pack of Scientology. He didn't look to any other sources. As I say, I had material from 150 people, as well as having Navy records, FBI records, Veterans Administration records, all sorts of material that I was able to get hold of before the internet and before you could simply look something up in a search engine. And indeed, many of the documents you'll find online about Scientology, I put them there back in the 1990s. So, yeah, and that's hopefully made it easier for people. But in gathering those documents, and again, the video about the perils of investigating Scientology talks about, the rigors of that particular discipline. What was I talking about, Spike? Where did I start this thought?
You were getting into why you started speaking out against Scientology, I believe.
Well, let's go in that direction. I started to speak out against Scientology publicly with some reluctance, but as I lost belief in the subject, I realized that most people had been cowed into silence by Scientology. It's one of the things Hubbard talks about when he talks about suppressive people and how they silence the people around them. And this is what Scientology was doing. And the more I found out about the harassment, particularly the cases in Canada and the United States and France, where And it happened here in the UK as well, though there was no prosecution. They've been infiltrating government agencies, stealing enormous amounts of material. I mean, the room I'm sitting in, you could probably fill floor to ceiling with the amount of documents they stole. They're also, 11 of them were convicted. There's a full confession by Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, called a stipulation of evidence, more than 200 pages, in which she admits kidnapping, false imprisonment, breaking and entering, burglary, the planting of bugs, the forging of government credentials as part of a great conspiracy. There are 38 unindicted co-conspirators in that case, one of whom was her husband, Ron Hubbard. And she basically signed the deal so that he would not have to go to prison. And he rewarded her when she'd done her time in prison by refusing to communicate with her ever again.
Class.
Yes, lovely man. So it was one of those situations. The more I spoke out, the more they harassed me. The more they harassed me, the more I needed to speak out. I had really not intended this as a career path.
You didn't?
I was quite happy as an artist exhibiting and selling paintings. I was making a meager living from doing that. And, this happened and it became necessary. It seemed that I had the qualifications. I understood Scientology, which is something I was going to talk about. Gordon Melton. That's where I tripped myself.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, somebody's got to pay attention. It's not really me. Yeah, Gordon Melton told me that he was going to write a book about Scientology when he retired, but that he'd given his box of materials to Janet Reitman and that she hadn't returned them. So I offered him access to my 60 boxes of material about Scientology, and he decided he wanted to write about vampires instead. The problem is with the many academics who have been paid money by Scientology, Frank Flynn is another example, that they've simply taken what Scientology tells them, understanding they're not going to be paid if they start saying anything negative. It was put to me by one of Gordon Melton's friends, he was a mutual friend, that my calling Gordon a mercenary was inappropriate because he'd made very little money from Scientology. It was sort of, well, okay, he's a mercenary and a poor businessman as well. Fletcher Prouty was making $1,000 a day making up stories about Hubbard being involved in US Navy intelligence, which is absolutely bogus, and we've disproven it point by point. Mm-hmm. So, standing up against Scientology, originally my friend Mitch said, well, give it another 6 months, and we kept on going. And the material was just so fascinating. Hubbard was he'd created such an illusion about himself that he was actually, I often tell Charlie Nairn, who made a documentary about Hubbard called The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, which has the only hostile TV interview. And is well worth watching. It's on YouTube.
Link in description below.
Link in description below. And he turned up in the early hours of the morning, and I think the ship was docked in Bizerte in Tunisia, but it was in North Africa. And because this is 1968, he had to find the ship, which was not easy. Mm-hmm. He arrived at 1 a.m. and he saw that Hubbard was walking along the deck, asked permission to go aboard, went aboard. And when I eventually talked to Charlie about this, who is a wonderful man, he said that he'd regretted all of his life since that he couldn't get Hubbard to say on camera what he'd said in the conversation before. Because Charlie said, this is a scam, isn't it? And Hubbard just agreed. Of course it is. Don't be so stupid. Anyone can see that. And he asked him, he sympathized with him and said, it must be hard pretending all the time to these people. And, that was poor Hubbard that had to make it all up all the time so the people wouldn't catch him out and throw him overboard, which is what he was doing to them. Only they probably wouldn't have pulled him back up if they'd found out what he was up to. But he asked him why he did it. And he said that the first thing was it was nice to tell his wife every night that he made $10,000, which in 1968 is a huge amount of money, hundreds of thousands, every day. But the real reason was he liked to catch the clever ones and reel them in.
Yeah.
And what we're listening to is somebody who has the maturity of a 10-year-old and is going to get revenge. It's like incels who go out and shoot people because they're getting revenge on women, as if there is any sense in any of that, and there isn't. But Hubbard was immature and had all sorts of psychiatric conditions going on. So I was named as an expert witness in the High Court in London in 1987. My own book, the original version of it, came out in 1990. Scientology desperately tried to prohibit it. And indeed, it was only 2 books have ever been restrained from publication since the foundation of the United States. One of them was Victor Marchetti's book about the CIA, and you can understand that there might have been national security interests there. And the other was my book, Piece of Blue Sky. And I had the same lawyer, Mel Wolfe.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And thankfully, when we lost the case, he convinced the publisher, who wanted to just walk away, that it was worth going into court for an appeal. We won everything on appeal, and the book was published. It, as far as I know, remains the only attempt at a history of Scientology, and runs beyond Hubbard's death into Miscavige's takeover. It became interesting. I'm regarded as a scholar. I indeed just had a chapter co-authored with Steve Hassan and 2 other people in the book Lone Act of Terrorism.
Yes.
Which calls me a practitioner scholar. So that's what I am now. I had a book, again, Steve and I collaborated on a chapter for psychiatry and anti-Semitism last year. And I sort of moved from wanting to understand, I understood the history of Scientology, the biography of Ron Hubbard. I avoided, I do talk about the cosmology of Scientology in Piece of Blue Sky, and I would aver that the only place that there's a description of the cosmology of Scientology is the chapter in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. Scientology, there are fragments of the cosmology blasted all over the place, but none of it's been brought together, in clear contradiction of Hubbard's statements about logic in the so-called data series. You're never told what the important information is, which according to him is paramount. You must know that, but he didn't bother to describe it. But so history of Scientology, biography of Hubbard, demonstration that Hubbard was a pathological liar, an examination of his character. I talked with psychiatrists to estimate his character. If he was paranoid, he was bipolar. He had serious depressive incidents. He would suffer from hypomania, where he would be extremely happy, and people are drawn to that aspect of such characters. He drank heavily. He used many drugs, opiate drugs, amphetamines, which he recommended in several places. In a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist, I cite lectures where he proposed that people should use amphetamines, particularly Benzedrine. That was his favorite. Also in a lecture, he admitted that he'd been addicted to a barbiturate drug, phenobarbital, which was a problem that recurred through his life. He tried to cash a prescription for it in 1965, 15 years after launching what would become Scientology. I found those things out, but I wanted to understand how do these mechanisms work? Why do relatively intelligent people and successful people become attracted to what now looks to me like a farrago of nonsense. Looking at Ron Hubbard's work, none of it seems rational, consistent to me. So why was I willing to believe it? And why were, I knew 7 people who'd been at Oxford University here who were in Scientology. I knew 8 medical doctors in the UK. 3 dentists.
These are not dumb people. We're verging into the next question, which is what prompted you to start studying other groups and forms of manipulation?
Yeah, well, let's address that. So it became evident to me. The first thing was to say, well, are there systematic ways of manipulating people? And I'd had a copy of Battle for the Mind by the psychiatrist William Sargent in my collection since before I got into Scientology, recommended to me by a psychiatrist I knew, and I saw a copy in a secondhand bookstore, bought it, didn't read it. And while his hypothesis is not correct, something like ultra paradoxical excitation of the brain, it was interesting to see that. I first really started thinking about such things when I read Conway and Siegelman's Information Disease, an article they wrote, which led me to read Snapping, their book. And here was this idea that you could suddenly switch a switch in a human being and they would be converted to a different set of beliefs. I didn't feel that I'd ever seen that, and I didn't feel that I'd experienced it, but that didn't mean that I rejected the hypothesis. They were talking about conversion experiences, which are very well described in Yuval Laor's work, which you can find on our YouTube channel. That, just opened floodgates. I read Sargent's book. I read Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control. I read the other 2 books that Sargent had written. I went through Mayalu's concepts of menticide, or the destruction of the mind. I read Lifton's, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. I read years after that, Lifton's book on Aum Shinrikyo, which is very good.
Destroying the World to Save It.
Yeah. And I read The True Believer. I went back to, which is, what's his name? Eric Hoffer, The True Believer. I read all sorts of books about hypnosis and started to see that it wasn't a matter of somebody becoming a Scientologist. It was a matter of somebody actually having their own intellectual defenses pierced and their emotions brought to bear. The center of this is what psychologist William James called feelings of knowing. He used the term, in fact, noesis, which has fallen out of use. Feelings of certainty, the sense of certainty. So, the born-again Christian who told me, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Those are feelings of knowing. It's not actual evidence that we're dealing with. That fascinated me, and I started to read voraciously about other groups that were being called cults, particularly the Moonies. I read a fair few books about the Moonies because there were a few available. I read about transcendental meditation. Indeed, Collins, the publishers, commissioned me to write a book about it, and I backed away from it because I decided I didn't want to be harassed by them as well. Yeah. But I did spend 6 months reading. So books like Persinger's TM and Cult Mania, which is very useful. Then you move over into the general field of social psychology. Cialdini's work, influence, is a necessity in understanding normal ways in which we are influenced. And if you don't want to be as influenced or as easily influenced, it's a good idea to read these things.
And it's interesting to note that he actually writes it as a way of, here's how you can use these tools ethically.
Yeah, Well, here's how these tools are used.
Yes.
I've been fascinated by public relations for a long time. In fact, it was Hubbard who introduced me to the subject when he was talking about marketing. And he said he'd read a recent Trout, Positioning the Battle for Your Mind. And so I read that as a neophyte in Scientology. I was 19 or so when I read it. And I realized that Hubbard hadn't actually grasped it, which was the first time very early on where I'm going, well, he's not understood what he's reading because his description of positioning is not the same as theirs. That was a realization I had many times over the years when I looked to the sources he'd pilfered material from, that it seemed that he could not help but change things. It seemed compulsive, that he had to change something about the original material. Now, of course, he put forward the hypothesis that for anything to persist, it must have a lie in it.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah, which he called alter isness. So I read Cutlip and Center, which was Hubbard's preferred PR manual. I then read Pratt-Carnis and Aronson, which is down here somewhere.
I have the cover on file.
Good. Age of Propaganda. I read Stuart Ewan and his book PR. And by the mid-90s, having been dragged through the courts by Scientology, at a point in English law where the man who was meant to be revising it, Lord Justice Wolfe, said, it is the case in English justice that he with the deepest pockets wins. And here I was, one guy against it, an organization with 40,000 members and a couple of $1 billion. What did I think I was doing? So as I withdrew from that, bloodied and slightly bowed, and started getting my health back, and I'd lost everything. I lost a 5-bedroom house in the attempt to pay legal costs, against this voracious monster. I started to look more widely than religious, commercial, therapy cults, the multi-level marketing and the large group awareness trainings. All of these things seem to be part of the pattern, but I was interested in the techniques involved. I studied hypnosis from the outside because I realized that as a Scientologist, I'd learned how to do it. And gaining control over other people was not my interest. It was how to help people relieve the control that they'd been put under. So I never did any courses in hypnosis. I studied neuro-linguistic programming from the outside and looked at the models that were being presented. And then chose terrorism as a study area, but in the 1990s, before 9/11, and realized that we were dealing with commonplaces, the fanaticism, the fervor, the desire for peak experiences, the bonding with the groupthink, the sense of obedience, that there were certain principles that were acting here. And that pushed me towards the desire to do preventative work, partly because it takes so long to recover. I've been active in the recovery of about 600 people over the years. It's not something I slowed down a lot on that in the 1990s, but nonetheless, people, I'll still be in touch with people by email or occasionally talk with somebody. And not all Scientologists, people from, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Rajneesh, the Krishnas, all sorts of groups. And it takes a long time for people to digest the experience of abuse and humiliation, and they may never fully digest it. Once it's suggested that they should be stronger and more competent and able to help people, but I fear that 99% of former members of these groups will not do anything other than railing against the group they were in and attacking the group they were in. I saw that we could give preventative education to kids and that they therefore wouldn't be taken into authoritarian groups and abusive relationships. And let's make a little detour on the term authoritarian. Over the years, many of us in the what some people call the counter cult field, I'm not sure that I would have described myself as that. I was helping cult members. I wasn't countering anything. I was helping people who'd been lied to, cheated, tricked, abused, and had their resources depleted completely and their relationships destroyed. And it became commonplace probably in the 90s for us to use the word totalist or the word totalitarian when describing such groups. And I, indeed, when we worked on the first edition of what is now Opening Our Minds, it seemed that the word, I used the word totalist, totalist groups. Mm-hmm. And then I sort of went, well, totalitarian is actually a portmanteau word. It's a compression of two words, total and authoritarian. I believe it was first used to describe Mussolini's fascism. And of course, we owe the word fascism also to Mussolini. He adopted it with a different meaning to its initial meaning. Comes from the fasces, the symbol of ancient Rome, a bundle of sticks with an axe, which is meant to represent the society bound together. We have the word religion from this same place, the ligare that tie the bundle together. We have the word ligament from ligare. Religion means to bind together, and the axe is what's going to happen to you if you try and get out of the bundle. I think I'm not really sure about Roman metaphors, but it seemed to me that any kind of authoritarianism was the problem. It wasn't somebody having total authority over you. It was somebody having authority over you, not in the sense of them having a better understanding of things. So, somebody is an authority on chemistry or physics or surgery or plumbing or, sailing or what have you. That is an absolutely legitimate form of authority. And they can teach people who know less than they do. But the other form of authority is rank authority. Mm-hmm. Somebody's the boss because they've got, insignia on, their epaulets or their arms. They're wearing a blue uniform or a funny wig. Rank authority is, again, not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is that when you join into a group of people, that if somebody is telling you what to do and it doesn't accord with your own experience, what Robert J. Lifton called ideology over experience. So you've taken cold showers and you felt good afterwards, but the leader says, no, cold showers are evil and you mustn't take them. So you stop taking cold showers. Now, I don't take cold showers, so I don't have a problem with any of that. But when you're doing something, I use Stevie Wonder's expression from Superstition. When you believe in something you don't understand, then you suffer. And I think he got it in one sentence, that's what authoritarianism is, that you have an authoritarian leader who they believe themselves to be not simply the gift of God, but God himself or herself, which proved to be the case with Hubbard, that his legacy is that he wishes to be revered as the source of all creation. This is probably, as Yuval Noah points out, because he had temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a whole other subject, which is well worth looking at with any authoritarian leader. So many of them seem to have the majority of the 18 traits of the Bear-Fedio checklist for temporal lobe epilepsy, what used to be called Dostoevsky syndrome, because Dostoevsky described his own condition very well in the novel. I think it's The Idiot is the novel where it's described, which I sadly haven't read. I'm getting to it. I am getting to it. But it seemed to me that authoritarianism is the target, not cults, not mind control or brainwashing or anything like that. It's authoritarianism where people don't develop and mature as individuals to the point where they can make decisions. So their decision making is made by other people. Seeing the commonplaces between cult groups of all types and among terrorist groups, also in human trafficking, modern slavery, also in pedophile grooming, that we see in pimping. If we look at the manuals written by pimps about how they control people, or look at The Deuce, which I'm afraid I was unable to watch. I was so horrified by the first episode, but there you go. But in domestic abuse, in the coercive control that we find in personal relationships, we find the same mechanisms operating. And that led me to, with the help of my brother Jim and Dick Kelly, to start the Open Minds Foundation back in 2015. And Spike and I worked there for 4 years or something. We put together nearly 400 articles, I think, between us.
Yeah.
I wrote 181, which you edited, and you probably wrote more, which I edited. And exploring this territory. At the same time, during that time, I wrote what is now Opening Our Minds, to say, hey, we're looking at the same schemes here. We're looking at the same approaches. And it went all through, I think, 19 revisions, that book, and 4 editions to get us to the edition we have, which is better than the earlier editions. So, it was worth it, but did became difficult, didn't it? We're, reworking and reworking and reworking. But it did lead me to certain very simple conclusions. The first is that we need to teach people to recognize human predators. It's all very well and good talking about psychopaths, sociopaths, Machiavellians, the malignant narcissists, whatever terms we want. But I'm not here to diagnose anything, because I'm not here to try and cure those people to the extent they can be curable. And they should be, and we should not be treating them with any lack of compassion. We should, however, as with Hannibal Lecter, put a mask on them so they can't bite people's noses off. More generally, we should restrain such people, but it should be done not with, the same kind of brutal violence that criminal psychopaths themselves exhibit.
To protect, not to punish.
Yes, people should be protected rather than punished. And the word punish is important because it means to inflict pain upon. That's its origin. But my concern was not to diagnostic. It was to say, if we recognize the behaviors of people who are mean, controlling, undermining, and unpleasant, then we'll have more chance of resisting them. And it will be less likely that we put them into positions of power, which has been our tendency. That Emory University in the US did a survey of US presidents up to Barack Obama, I think, up to but not including Barack Obama. And they declared that, so that would be what, 43 or 44 presidents?
43.
43. So they declared that every successful president, every president considered successful, suffered from the narcissistic personality disorder. And certainly there are behaviors that were quite predatory and unpleasant in a number of celebrated presidents. Let's not get into a list here because I don't want to become too unpopular. No. Just unpopular enough. So the first thing was, how do you recognize a predator? It takes a single page to describe that. And you can put it up on your refrigerator and download it for free. By understanding those techniques, that became the focus for me, that the techniques are not difficult to understand. So, for example, the technique of reciprocity, which Cialdini talks about, Bob Cialdini, where if somebody gives you something, you feel you ought to give something back. That's why you're given free samples of shampoo and cosmetic products, because they're hoping it will stimulate reciprocity. It's why Krishna monks used to walk the streets and give you a pack of incense sticks. I'm told that joss stick is not a common phrase which is what both the Indians and the British call incense sticks. But they give them to you, their spiritual sky, which were very good, though I'm afraid all joss sticks are carcinogenic, so it's not really a great idea having smoke in your environment, kids. Just put the perfume in if you want the smell, not the smoke.
Or even coming into play in some spiritual groups, I've given you this big knowledge, thus you owe me.
So once you've understood that, then you can do as a friend of mine did when a Krishna monk had loaded him down with incense sticks and records and things of this, and he just walked off, and the Krishna monk said, hang on, aren't you going to give me anything? He said, you told me these were gifts and I thank you for them. But it's easy to, once we know the tricks, it's much harder for somebody to pull them. So once you've seen my friend Roger Nygaard's film Suckers and watched the documentary with it, then you will be able to tell the car salesman which step they've got to in the process of trying to con you out of your money. Very, very useful. More so in the US than here, because while they use similar practices, the procedures through which you pay for a car and the extras and all of that are not the same here. It's not quite as ruthless in the UK as it is in the US in the sales environment. So it became imperative to me. The third part that, so you have human predators, how to recognize them, the techniques they use, and then you have how to discern whether you're being given valuable and truthful information. My favorite video on our YouTube channel is definitely Andy Knowles Debunked, because it gave me the chance to take a series of statements that are made by a man who is profoundly irrational and admits it. He calls himself a space cowboy, somebody who's stoned all the time. And he argues that I fall down because I won't accept weak evidence, and he's right, but these ways of thinking, how do you discern whether something is fake news, whether it's propaganda? And so my work now is solely making videos, the channel. I'm technically retired, giving the occasional public talk. I spoke at Eton College in March, which was incredible. It was great fun. And I speak at the occasional conference. But my concern is to get preventative education out there. And to that effect, I'm working on a curriculum for the UK education system, which, if we're successful, will get into 4,000 schools and teach children between the ages of 11 and 13, which for me is the critical point. And various psychological studies back this up. To recognize predators, to understand the techniques they're using, and to be able to evaluate information better. And it's not going to change the world overnight. It'll probably take several weeks, but there'll be a generation growing up who will not be as susceptible to recruitment into authoritarian groups and abusive relationships. We also are working with a guy with a PhD in Oregon. We've just started talking with him about some sort of curriculum for high school. So this is, I'm kind of winding down on the cult stuff. I keep doing it because fascinating people like Karen de la Carrière want to talk with me. But my focus for a long time has been on, since the mid-1990s, has been on how authoritarianism is wrecking our society. And that by understanding authoritarianism, by focusing on that, we can perhaps do something about the likes of Vladimir Putin, people who have got to power by democratic means because of an authoritarian public, because people are going, well, he looks certain, so let's follow him.
All the answers.
Yeah. And, we've been critical on the channel of Democrats and Republicans, not taking any side. I'm certainly not lured by the mainstream media as this kind of a knee-jerk response of people who disagree with you is to believe that you're part of the camp they disagree with, the controlled opposition or some nonsense like this. My research has been highly independent and tends to disagree with everybody, which doesn't necessarily get me the fans, because I am not a fan of our political systems. They are too authoritarian. The left-wing systems are authoritarian, the idea of state control. The right-wing systems are authoritarian, their pretense at meritocracy. We need, instead of having, a group of plutocrats basically bending the government to their needs through the supply of armaments and this sort of thing, we actually need a real democracy where people are well informed enough, educated enough to do something to make a society that doesn't fight wars, that doesn't despoil the environment. Just this week, a New Scientist published a piece on the fashion industry. And I'm kind of going, look, 15 years ago, this was something I was complaining about, the use of cotton at all, because it just, the water table is sinking in Egypt, in Bangladesh and India. There are going to be terrible droughts because of the growing cotton, and it's an awful material. But we have throwaway fashion, disposable fashion. I was shocked to read something like, the average T-shirt is worn 5.5 times. I'm not sure how you wear something half the time, and this T-shirt here, I've had for the last 2-3 years,
I was just about to say, I've worn this at least dozens of times. It's one of my favorites.
And all of my shirts, all of my trousers for the last 2 decades have come from thrift stores, charity shops, because I happen to live in a very well-to-do area, so people get rid of very good quality clothes. So we are destroying the environment for humanity. The cockroaches will probably be okay, though they won't survive a nuclear winter. That's a myth, I'm told. But we are, as a society, we're committing suicide by having coal-fired power stations and just producing incredible amounts of waste that we can't dispose of. I think that we're not going to get clever enough to change that until we as individuals can take responsibility. And that means getting rid of authoritarianism. It means I'm responsible for what I do. I'm not doing it, I'm not going to be forced into doing things just because 40,000 people with $2 billion want to stop me from talking. Doesn't mean I'm going to stop talking. And that's been the case. So what else have you got on your list?
Your largest contribution you've made to our field?
My contribution to the field has really been to emphasize the work of other people. And I think the most important work that I've been involved with is undoubtedly Yuval Noah's work, which is still coming to recognition. So it was very exciting to meet Yuval the first time in 2015 when we were at Toronto doing the Getting Clear seminar. And he walked up to me and shook my hand and said he'd been using my work for 20 years. This is like when Jimi Hendrix went up to Buddy Guy and said, I learned so much from you. And Buddy Guy said, I didn't get any checks. So I'm still waiting for that. But it meant that he started to talk about his groundbreaking work on awe and fervor. And I'd for a long time been talking about how our intelligence serves our stupidity. That it's how, so all of the push to have, critical thinking taught, which is a very good idea. But the point is it won't resolve the problems, because even people who are remarkably good at critical thinking can have some pretty batty ideas. Galileo, Newton, Faraday. Faraday was a member of a group called the Sandemanians. Yet he is the greatest scientist in the field of early field of electricity and the understanding of it. Often when we look at brilliant people, they have very strange ideas. The Niels Bohr, who gave us the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, had some pretty interesting mystical ideas. He had the Tai Chi, what people call the yin yang, on his coat of arms when he was made a baron in Denmark. So it's, you know, it's a mistake to think that there is such a thing as reasoning and such a thing as emotion, that they are separate compartments in a human being. Everything we do is subjective, and everything has a confirmation or my side bias that we will argue towards. So
I would like to put in, though, that you have also informed some of Yuval's research too. You have helped him finesse it and added dimensions to it.
Well, I was going to say that I, you know, if I have indeed made a contribution, then when Yuval showed me his model of love, of attachment, he had all of the familial attachments, and he'd understood them in detail. He'd understood, for example, that the love a teenager feels for a parent is different to the love a younger child feels. He'd seen that what we call cult groups, authoritarian groups, there is a parental figure, and then the other members are your siblings. He'd also seen that we adopt friends as siblings. He'd seen also, and this I'd never seen before, was the idea that the teachings of the group are the baby. You mustn't insult somebody's baby, you know. So if you say anything bad about, you know,
and that's why we get such over-the-top emotional reactions when you say your group's a cult, you know, how dare you?
Yeah, and I mean, so I pointed towards the notion of infatuation, which for me has long been the essential understanding of groups, that we become infatuated. And it's a great word because it comes from the word fatuous, meaning silly.
Yes.
Make somebody silly. And we will tend, when we're infatuated, to only see the good in whatever we're infatuated with. You know, as the divorce approaches, what was called spontaneity, what was admired as spontaneous behavior, will now be impetuous behavior. So things are recharacterized. But there is that honeymoon phase where people join a group, very much like a marriage, that in the early days there can be this thing. And I wanted to say that there are, outside of these, you know, natural familial ideas, there is also, some psychologists call it limerence. This, and that, what's essential to me is that that's what we want. We want to fall in love with things. When we go, you know, on Amazon to look at things, we want to fall in love. And by the time it's arrived, the package has arrived, it's not necessarily very interesting anymore because we want to fall in love with something else. Understanding that tendency in ourselves, I think, is very important. And I think Yuval and I still talk pretty much every week for an hour or so. And I think having been a sounding board for his ideas has been important. And otherwise, trying to bring complex ideas in psychology where they're often very poorly expressed. That's not the case with Cialdini or with Candice Narrison, or indeed with Zimbardo. They're all very good communicators.
Yes.
But often we find ourselves with some bizarre term that, you know, is not self-explanatory. So I think pushing to rebrand our field and say we are dealing with authoritarianism. We're not dealing with counterfeit spirituality. That is an aspect of authoritarianism. We're not dealing with cults. We're dealing with authoritarian cults, groups that are formed around a dangerous individual principle. To use the word manipulation rather than getting caught up in whether brains can be washed or not, which is essentially there's an awful lot of misinformation about that out there. For example, the idea that Edward Hunter worked for the CIA or that he introduced the term brainwashing, neither of which is true, but you'll find them in hundreds of books and articles now, those statements. Statement was first used in English in the Times of India in January of 1950. Hunter first used it in September. I think a Miami newspaper. So, and he didn't work for CIA at any point. The Hunter Archive makes that clear. He had worked for its wartime equivalent, the OSS, and was doubtless, in touch with CIA people. But as he's not the origin of the term, it's an unnecessary meander. But one does like the occasional unnecessary meander.
We love your meanders, Jon. What's the best advice you can give to someone who has a loved one in an authoritarian group?
Maintain friendly communication. Be in touch as much as you can and listen to what's being said. Don't antagonize the person. Don't try and present them with newspaper clippings about the group, and take expert advice. I would definitely recommend reading Stephen Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control, and Margaret Singer and Janja Lelich's book, Cults in Our Midst. And probably Tobias and Lalich's Take Back Your Life, which, although it's intended for former members, I think is useful to those who have somebody who's involved. And of course, my own Opening Our Minds.
Of course.
But the thing is you want to have the person explain to you what it is that they found attractive, because often in trying to express something, we find that it's not quite what we thought, and it can stimulate thought. But be very careful not to be critical or hostile, and to be welcoming, not to be making little sniping comments, or treat the person as somebody, even though it may be your own child who you've known for a lifetime, treat them as somebody that you want to befriend. Approach them in the same way that you would approach a stranger that you really want to get to know, and treat them with courtesy and respect. And don't give them money or anything they can sell to give money to the group. But do what you can, because when the bubble bursts, and most of the time it will eventually, they will come to you. If they find themselves, lost in another country with no contact with anybody, then things, when the cult throws them out or they leave, it's very hard to save face. It's very hard to go back to people who told you were wrong and say, yes, I was wrong.
Then to follow up, how about the best advice you can give someone who has recently left an authoritarian group?
Sleep. Sleep, first of all. Then spend as much time as you spend fretting about the group and finding out about the group, doing something you like doing. If you like swimming, do that. Hiking, something that's positive. I'm not talking about eating chocolate as a sort of half your time eating chocolate, half your time reading about. Do something that you enjoy, but that is useful to you. Get exercise. Actually, don't eat. You can eat as much chocolate as you like, as long as it doesn't have sugar with it. So 100% chocolate is absolutely a health food, but the amount of sugar that's put with it, you need to be making sure that you're getting enough protein, a reasonable diet. Find other people, and this is easily done online and anonymously. Find other people who've been through the experience and recovered. Be careful not to join groups of unrecovered people who simply want to hate the group. I've been called several times, a number of times, I've been called an anti-Scientologist. Nothing could be further from the truth. The man who runs Scientology, David Miscavige, and the man who founded Scientology, Ron Hubbard, were anti-Scientologists. They were people who were consuming and destroying the lives of these people. I have been a pro-Scientologist since I left, and have risked everything, really everything, to help people who, I'm sad to say, for the most part, are relatively ungrateful. But virtue is its own punishment, and I'm a happy man, so who cares?
Okay, let's see. How could education be changed to prevent involvement in harmful authoritarian groups and abusive relationships?
Our education system needs of itself to examine the authoritarian practices that are taking place. So that would be the first thing, to reform an education system and repurpose it. So why are we educating people? And we should be educating people so that by the time they're 18, they're mature enough to be responsible for their own decisions. What we're actually doing is not that. And I think our universities are also at fault. The people tend to be given a blinkered vision. And often the subjects being taught are not entirely relevant to living a life in the world. So, as my mum used to say, all children should know how to look after a baby. It's basic. I think wallpapering is quite a useful skill as well, but not a necessity. Certainly learning how to grow plants, how to do your own laundry, which I wish my children would. Things of this nature are important. But overall, it's understanding this principle of self-responsibility, of creating an identity that isn't, what soccer team you support or your national identity, but an identity that depends on your skills and competences and your beliefs, things that you can find for yourself. I do not believe the concept that the majority of people are too stupid to do this. I think that the system is stupid, not the people. So there are many changes, but Sir Ken Robinson's work is extremely good on this. And Matthew Lipman, the former Columbia philosophy professor, his Socrates for 6-year-olds, as it's been called because of a lovely little documentary of that name. These are very good ideas that change the nature of authoritarianism and that empower students to develop and become responsible members of society. So I think these are essential understandings that we need to change. We need to be, we're not making cannon fodder, which was the idea of the first universal education system in Prussia in 1806. It's not so we'll have better soldiers, which is of course why the Boy Scouts were formed. Sorry, but that's what Baden-Powell was. He was a soldier and he was making soldiers. That was his idea. It's not to homogenize populations, which was the American adoption of universal education. And it's not so that women can go and work in the factories, which is why universal education was adopted in Britain. It's actually to create a pro-social society, a society where people realize that, it is a great thing to help others. And if you want satisfaction in life, doing that will give you much more satisfaction than wearing the same lip gloss as Beyonce. And, it's probably good lip gloss, don't get me wrong. I don't want to be sued by the manufacturers. But this whole, follow the leader, do what the flock does, impress your neighbors, we need to grow out of that. And schools, schools should be the most important place in our society. But because teachers are not, and it varies, in Germany, there is respect for school teachers. There isn't here and there isn't in the US. And we need to get past that.
Yeah. What's the best thing a group could do? Say I was going to form a group. What would the best thing I could do to keep it from eventually becoming an authoritarian group?
Well, a group needs to have a devil's advocate, and it needs to have the concept of devil's advocacy. So if people gain merit by pointing out the faults in a system, then if we rewarded whistleblowers rather than destroying them, and we encourage that kind of debate, this is very well covered by Ira Chalef in his work on courageous followership, which I heartily recommend to everybody.
Yes.
And also his book, Intelligent Disobedience, which
yes.
in terms of changing the education system, getting kids so that they can be assertive, so that they can say what they think and feel and won't be ridiculed and will be encouraged. Discouragement is a dreadful aspect of our educational system.
Yes.
I also think we ought to completely abandon the examination system. The Finns have shown that by having only one exam in their whole system, you sit an exam at the end, and they have higher literacy levels and higher numeracy levels than the US or Britain have ever achieved. They don't teach reading and writing until you're 7, but they have higher literacy levels. So all of this force, all of this testing people and keeping them in a constant state of anxiety about their grades, we need to be rid of that if we're to be a cooperative rather than a competitive society.
Fair enough. Okay, what would you like to be remembered for when you're gone?
It reminds me, I think it was the actor Robert Morley who was asked about his reputation after he died, and he said, "I'll be dead. Why should I care?" And it's not really a thought. I would like what I've done to be useful. Whether my name is attached to it or not, it seems narcissistic.
Yeah,
having said that, I'd like people to read my novels, look at my paintings, listen to the music that I will be soon recording.
Yeah.
But the thing is to have made a positive difference, which I think we should all aim to do, and because my view is that we're all threads in the tapestry, and so I'd like my thread to be strong when people pull on the tapestry, but that's about all I don't really have any aspirations for fame.
Oh, good. Let's see. We have the one that if I'm going to write your biography, what would you like the title to be?
Well, probably something comic and self-deprecating, but
we'll have to look at that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all these serious questions. I did have a couple of extra silly questions to amuse our patrons.
Yep, they need to be amused.
They need to be amused.
Yeah.
Okay, if you, like Faust, could choose one perfect moment, what would it be?
From my past, you mean?
Past, future? What would the perfect moment be?
Yeah, I do. There are several perfect moments. So I have 4 children, the birth of my children, first seeing my grandchild, and the first time that I kissed my fiancée 2 years ago. Yeah, well, it was an incredible moment. It a transcendent moment.
Okay, good.
We couldn't stop doing it for quite a long time because you'd had 2 months, in lockdown of masks and not being able to touch each other, and then suddenly we did, and it was incredible.
Put the link to your love in coronavirus up.
Yes, love in the time of corona.
Love it. Okay, you have annoyed a wizard who's going to turn you into an animal. However, you get to choose the animal. What would be your choice and why?
It would have to be some form of cat, because they're the most beautiful and physically the most remarkable creatures that I saw a documentary where somebody's cat had fallen 19 stories,
and they can twist around,
walked away. So to be and watching my own cat stretching, and so yeah, I think probably some kind of cat, and not one of the bigger ones, because I'm told that lions have terrible bad breath. So
and you don't want that.
Of course not. So maybe maybe a leopard of some kind, or a cheetah. Okay. They're quite nice, or a lynx. But Some kind of cat, I think, yeah.
Okay. If you could have dinner and a long talk with one person from history, living or dead, who would it be?
Well, living, it would probably be Robert J. Lifton.
Oh, yeah. I'd love to meet him.
And that's embarrassing because, of course, we have a mutual friend, Steve Hassan, and I never. I did send him a copy of the book, but he is a remarkable and brilliant man. In history, Baruch Spinoza, probably, the philosopher, because he changed the possible perception of humanity, I think. But there are so many remarkable, Rembrandt, and, I revere Rembrandt, but I do accept that he was an absolute narcissist. When he was 13 or 14 years old, he was already saying, I'm the greatest painter in the world. And he pretty nearly was, The painter Kandinsky or Franz Marc, I'd love to have met them. Bertrand Russell, whose work I've been reading recently, who, again, though, he's said to have had quite bad breath, so it'd have to have sat at a distance,
Once again, okay.
Or Dostoevsky. Whoa, what a mind, what an incredible man.
Be interesting, yeah.
A lot of people.
Okay.
Have a big dinner party, okay? And obviously,
fair enough.
Jesus, but he had a bit of a problem with dinner parties, so.
Yeah.
But the Buddha, Muhammad, Zoroaster, any of Confucius, Lao Tzu, and maybe if we're going to have philosophers at the top of the list, would be Zhang Tzu.
Okay.
Or Epictetus, he was pretty interesting. Marcus Aurelius, too many interesting people.
You're getting a very full table here, John.
That's good. I can move around, As long as the food's good, the food will have to be good.
Okay. Due to being unbearably smug, you have been sentenced to be marooned on an island and allowed to take only 3 items with you. People don't count. Assuming there's plenty of food, water, and shelter to keep you alive, what are the 3 things you would take?
Well, the first would be a hard drive recorder with,
okay.
With a lot of music on it.
Okay.
And a system to play that. The second would have to be the British Library.
The whole British Library.
Yeah, or the Library of Congress. I don't mind which.
Okay.
And the third would have to be a drum kit, but it would have to be a Roland TD-50X, because that's what I play. And that's one of the great privileges of my life, that I actually have the top of line electronic drum kit. It can emulate any acoustic drum kit. I've played one of their kits for all 15 years now, but I recently managed to get a TD-50 by spending all the money I had in the world. So please put more into the Patreon account.
Well, those are all the questions. Any other thing that you want to get down here on the record?
Well, if speaking for our patrons, one of the things that I've engaged my mind with many things over the years and been fascinated by many things. And one of those is tomatoes. That for 14 years, with the exception of 1 year, I've grown 30 or 40 tomato plants, usually of about 10 different varieties. And I've just finished reading 2 books about tomatoes. And one of them I have right here, this is one of the most beautiful books I've ever owned. And I've got some pretty nice books.
Epic tomatoes.
Got that kind of chalkboard hippie.
Oh, I love it.
But it's beautifully illustrated, and Craig LaHulia, who wrote it, I didn't realize when I bought the book, but the greatest variety of tomato, the benchmark for tomatoes, having grown hundreds of varieties over the years, I guess, is the Cherokee chocolate.
You've talked about that before.
Yeah, he was the man that hybridized it, which I didn't know when I brought the book. He's introduced more than 100 tomatoes. He also reintroduced the ancestor of the Cherokee chocolate, which is the Cherokee purple, and he bred the Cherokee green. And in this book, amazingly, he doesn't mention the Russian black. And this is before the Ukraine war. So it's, to me, very odd, because to me, these are the two of the thousands, there are about 10,000 varieties of tomato. But these two, so that's the other thing I'd mention about myself, that I'm fascinated. And that seems to differentiate me from many people. I dropped out of school. Maybe everybody should know this. When I was 17, yes. I had somebody when I was in Scientology, she came up and said, it's all very easy for people like you who've been to university. It's like, not me. I've been there, you know, and had a cup of tea, but I've never studied in that situation. And I realized that the difference between me, what the problem with schools is that they destroy curiosity. They make learning boring. And my education is something, I'm an autodidact. I found things myself because I've never stopped being fascinated. And that led us to Andrew Gold, when he interviewed me, asked me some daft questions, bless him. And I pointed out to him that I do know what my epitaph will be. And having been through a pretty difficult life, all in all, with 16 years of harassment and the loss of a house, which I think is now worth almost $1 million along the way in litigation, that, you know, I'm now a happy human being. And which, you know, who knows how long that lasts for, but it's you know, it's where I am now. And so my epitaph will be celebrate. You know, I'm not looking to go to heaven. I'm not looking to be reborn. It's more of a kind of Walt Whitman, you know, under the dust under the soles of your shoes. Look for me there. But it's been, you know, Wittgenstein, who basically appears to have had a very severe Asperger's syndrome and really didn't have any friends. And it destroyed all of philosophy at the age of 24 with the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and nobody could answer it. And 11 years later, he came back and said, look, obviously this is what's wrong with it. You know, so he was just off on his own. And he ended up, you know, working as a gardener. And at his on his deathbed, his landlady, and there was nobody else around, he said, tell them it was wonderful. And I think it is, despite everything else. And we should celebrate and eat tomatoes. But only really good tomatoes, you know. They're very good for you.
Yes, they are. Well, I think that's all we have to cover. Thank you very much for all of this. This has been fascinating.
Good. Good.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
Somebody's got to pay attention. It's not going to be me.